and welcome to the Energy Talk podcast, where we tell stories about the energy transition in the global south. My name is Olubumi Olajide. This is the penultimate episode in our series on distributed energy for people and the planet, produced in collaboration with the Global SDG 7 Hubs and the Energy Action Project. This is part 2 on the intersection between cooling, climate, and energy, and speaking specifically on how it affects those on the front lines. And this mirrors very nicely as COP is still going on in Dubai. And while the conversations that are happening at that conference are very important to the overall climate change ecosystem, there's still no replacing actual work on the ground, doing projects and improving lives of people in the global south. Now, before I hand over to the host for this episode, Marilyn Smith, I want to remind you to please subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen. And also, if you do find this podcast interesting or valuable, to please recommend it to a friend or a colleague. And now I hand over to Marilyn to introduce our guest and get us into the episode.
In the northeast corner of Paris, France, not far from where I live, a massive cast iron and glass building houses a cultural center that attracts thousands of visitors every weekend. At 20,000 square meters, the Grand Hall of La Villette has more than enough space for a large concert room, exhibits, several shops, and a handful of restaurants. The latter is truest of the original use of this building, which dates back to the 1860s. For most of a century, it was commonly known as the City of Blood. Serving as the sole slaughterhouse for the entire city, up to 19,000 sheep and 5,000 oxen were butchered here on a daily basis. While this sordid history is well known among Parisians, relatively few are likely aware of the technological advance that led to the Grand Hall being shuttered in the 1970s. The birth of refrigerated transport made it more cost-efficient to butcher livestock on or near farms and bring only the meat into the city. In the last episode of this podcast series, we learned about the importance of cooling for the built environment to support the health and well-being of people where they live and work. Now we turn to cooling for livelihoods in the global south, where millions of very poor people still farm 1-acre plots or raise a handful of animals. It's important to keep in mind that many of these people have little or no access to reliable electricity, which makes cooling even more challenging. But for both of our guests on this episode, challenge equals opportunity. Ralph Roothaert is an innovation facilitator and country director for Kenya with the World Vegetable Center. World Veg, as it is commonly known, is an international organization that conducts research, builds networks, and carries out training and promotion activities to raise awareness of the role of vegetables for improved health and global poverty alleviation. Much of Ralph's work on cooling aims to reduce spoilage of leafy greens that make up much of the African diet and are grown in the kitchen gardens of women who might never walk more than a few miles from their home villages. In sharp contrast, Anshul Ojha is tackling the cooling challenge for people who almost never stay put and live many months of the year in extreme heat. Founder of the Desert Resource Center in Rajasthan in northern India, Anshul is keen to help desert nomads derive value from the milk and meat of their camels, sheep, and goats. Both organizations place strong emphasis on developing low-cost technologies that can improve livelihoods while also seeking to draw out knowledge about sustainable living that could be vital for the future of our planet. Ralph, let's start with the vegetable course. Please tell us about World Veg and who you work with in Africa.
Our mission is to alleviate poverty, improve livelihoods, income, and employment. And we do that for the population that live in the rural areas that are dependent on farming and who are generally much poorer than the city folk. So we're dealing with smallholders, typically ranging, their farm sizes are about an acre. So we're dealing with small quantities, a lot of farmers, each of them producing small quantities of vegetables. Vegetables are a very perishable commodity. But even among all the different vegetables, some are even more perishable than others. For instance, potatoes or cabbage, they have a pretty good shelf life. But in Africa, we are dealing with traditional African vegetables. And these vegetables, they are leafy vegetables. And basically, they have to be consumed within 24 hours after you harvest them from the field. So the implication of not having cooling is that your value chains are extremely short from the field to the fork. So what we see at the moment is that farmers, if they have a consignment and they have an obligation to deliver vegetables to a restaurant, they wake up very early to pick the vegetables and get it on the transport, on the pickup. And so it goes as quickly as possible to the outlet. So that's not the ideal life, waking up 3-4 o'clock in the morning. Or farmers pick late at night, and so that at the cool time of the day, and then keep the vegetables somewhere, and then still it is getting wilted, but somehow it's not as wilted as much.
Anshul, I once did an overnight camel ride into the Thar Desert and remember a young boy following us for miles so that once we settled into camp, he could sell us cold drinks. Of course, they were not cold at all after hours in the hot sun. Given how barren such deserts are, it's difficult for most of us to imagine how nomads do eke out a livelihood. Can you help us better understand their situation?
Now, deserts have, again, world over, very rich production systems, which are, yes. So, desert is largely a, livestock-based economy per se. Most of it is actually meat economy. Historically, these people have migrated or have been on the move for as long as 8 to 9 months of the year. So there would be two migration cycles, one at the start of the winter or little earlier than that, and one which would be at the beginning of the summers. And they would travel as far as 800,000 kilometers, crossing the entire desert, entering the greener pastures of another state in India, say Himachal or Haryana, which are northerly. Or in the westerly sides, they would go towards Gujarat. These are significant movements and very important because the entire living of these communities is linked with them, right? Their cultures, their practices, everything is linked with their movements. Now you juxtapose that with another layer of problem, which is the shift from the traditional local livelihood opportunities for pastoralists. The modern infrastructure or the modern machineries like tractors, they took away the opportunities from these people. And in a way, they deeply dented the pastoral production systems. But what we are now trying to do is also, in addition to meat economy, promote the dairy value chains with these communities. A big bottleneck is actually the cold chain availability. There is no livelihood because there is no infrastructure available for this product, extremely therapeutic camel milk, extremely therapeutic goat or sheep milk and derivatives to really go out in the market where the demand is. How do we create cold chain? Again, which is decentralized, run on PRE, and it is able to facilitate the yield to the markets.
You have both nicely set the stage to discuss the same need, that is, for cooling, in two very different contexts for different products and different people. Let's turn the conversation then to technology solutions. Ralph, please take us back to Africa and what World Veg is developing that could be of relevance to millions of smallhold farmers.
One of the technologies that the World Veg has developed with partners is called Zero Energy Cooling Chamber. It's a very simple structure, low cost. Everyone can make it with local materials. It basically consists of a structure made out of mud bricks that are produced everywhere in the rural areas in Africa, maybe 2 by 3 meters wide. So you have like 4 walls, maybe of 1 meter high. And then there are double walls, and within the walls you have some sand. The whole thing is then also has a top, a lid made out of wood or thatch. And the whole thing is also ideally in a shade, or you can make a shade. So what you do, the technique is about cooling through water evaporation. So you pour water in the sand that is contained in the two walls, and then you have a natural cooling ability, and you get a drop in temperature. So that's a technology that works very well in hot areas and dry areas, because the drier the area, the more evaporation you have of the water, so the more cooling.
I saw when looking at the World Veg website that you also have charcoal coolers. Can you tell us more about them?
The principle is similar. So you build four walls, and then the walls are actually made of chicken wire, chicken mesh, and in between the chicken mesh is a layer of charcoal. And of course, you also need a proper roof, little thatch to keep them. Then on top of the charcoal, you pour water. That water seeps through the charcoal structure, all the walls. And again, you get a temperature drop between 5 and 10 degrees Celsius. You have a room, and usually the charcoal coolers are slightly bigger. So you have, let's say, the size of a normal room and a bedroom kind of size. This is actually a structure that we propose for larger collection centers where you have more volumes.
Both of the examples you've just given are passive cooling techniques that are super important considering the vast numbers of smallhold farmers or pastoralists in the Global South who have no or little access to electricity. Are you also working on solutions that are larger yet optimized for off-grid electricity systems?
If we want to be even more sophisticated, we can consider containers that are commercially available, like cooling containers made out of sea freight containers. And in Kenya, there's companies now such as Enview that provide these movable cold rooms. What they are is just basically metal structures, but on top of the metal container, you have solar panels. And the solar panels are connected to a cooling mechanism that provides a cold temperature inside the cold room. So as you can imagine, this is a little bit more expensive, more sophisticated.
Anshul, the challenge you described of finding ways to take cooling to people who are always on the move in extremely hot and constantly changing landscapes is particularly fascinating. What have you been able to devise in this case?
In Bahula's case, a very interesting thing they're doing is how they are picking these products and they're developing passive solutions for their milk value chain, right? There are few interesting startups here. One is Inficol, another is Prompt. There is another which is called New Leaf. And they have various technologies which they have developed. One is thermic fluid or PCM based cooling. And I'm talking about the active cooling space. And the New Leaf, which is using farm waste or farmyard manure as the fuel for heat exchangers. We are deploying them, we are learning from them, we are exploring partnerships, deepening them, and deploying these solutions. So that is one space. The second is people like Samakia. How do you promote them? How do they innovate at local with the community? And then you take them to the much larger space. So it is working both ways for us.
In what you have both described, livelihoods are very linked to lifestyles. How does that influence what you need to do and how you need to do it?
What we are trying to do, focusing on desert land, desert life, and desert living in these three verticals, we're trying to work with communities in deserts, develop models which could provide alternative solutions to their local livelihood opportunities, A, B, linking them with distant markets, C, developing models which could be replicated elsewhere. And all of this we do in a way through four important verticals. The first is technology, the most important part, and how do you promote innovations sitting at the grassroots, working with the communities. Other three verticals where we work is resources, knowledge, and the larger partnerships. How do you bring in various resources for these production systems? How do you bring in the knowledge and actually both ways, how do you take or absorb the knowledge from these communities and then take it to other places and then bring in knowledge? So a knowledge bridging becomes a very important function. And how do you then forge these partnerships?
What does that mean in practical terms?
On these important verticals, we work largely in the space of communities, in the space of markets, and in the space of policies. Let me give you a few examples. How do we operate in markets? So a Desert Resource Center would pick a value chain, would work around this for, some initial stage with communities, design the problem statement properly, and then look at innovations and bridging those innovations and market through the social enterprises, which would be pretty promoted by us, which would have stakeholding of the community. For example, there are these two very recent enterprise promoted by us, and both are very pertinent to discuss here because they both have very unique applications and the solutions in the cooling space.
In my introduction, I mentioned how being able to cool goods that were in transport disrupted supply and value chains in the meat market in France in the 1970s. How do the technologies and approaches you are applying now do the same in the contexts that you are working in?
The farmers usually sell at farm gate. It's easier, especially because of the perishability of the products. If you have a trader who comes and buys from your farm gate, or even better, harvest from your farm, and then you weigh and sell the amount of crop that the person has harvested from your field, you have no responsibility anymore. The risk of farm losses, food losses, are now transferred to the trader. But you're a price taker. So producers tend to get a very little piece of the cake or the profit in the whole value chain. And if you would have cooling, then there would be more opportunities and more bargaining power for the farmers we work with. So if you want to move beyond and get higher profits, you need to be able to negotiate. Because of the small scale nature, people have to be together, and we organize them in vegetable business networks. So vegetable business networks is a way to not only bring all the different actors in the value chain together, input suppliers like seed providers, technology providers, producers, transporters, traders, and retailers. But it's also a way to create an economy of scale so that when input providers come and sell something, seeds or information, they talk to a group of farmers. And when traders come, they don't only buy from individual farmers, but they buy produce from a group of farmers. So aggregation centers are a vehicle to do that. So aggregation centers are simple structures in collaboration with local governments. So the local governments provide a piece of land. The vegetable business network runs it, and produce are being brought there once or twice a week. Traders are invited. There's volume. There's some sorting. There's grading, and there's protection from the sun. So some farmers do come together, particularly in the vegetable business networks that we have established, about 200 of them in Ethiopia. So that's where like 25, 30 farmers come together. So the next step that we are now engaged in is inviting other service providers, cooling technology providers such as Enview, to create these cooling facilities so that the products can be stored for a couple of days rather than just one day. So I must say this is still in the development process that we haven't reached there yet, but it's being developed at the moment.
How does the Desert Research Center go about building value chains, Anshul?
We just started sort of in the last 4 or 5 years the work. And this in the context where in the last 15 years, almost 40% of the camel population in the country has been lost because there were very few people who were interested in continuing it. Why? Because there was no value chain. There's nothing which would enable these herders convert their camels from liabilities to assets. So how do you create systems which provide these local opportunities? And in that, cooling technologies which are decentralized, which have as much as possible and as efficient as possible local solutions is very instrumental. Bahula Naturals is a dairy company which is focusing its work promoted by us, focusing on camel and sheep or goat herders, developing a very decentralized value chain. Camel herders or sheep herders, they are not stationary people. They are always moving. And designing any value chain around them is a very unique challenge. You cannot have large collection centers where you expect people to bring in their produce. What you have to do is chase them when they are moving and develop very small solutions, very efficient, which could help them manage their costs, which could help the enterprise control the costs within the system and yet able to bring the material. So how do we, within the market space, develop these linkages once we have initiated some work with the community and then take it to policy for a much larger replication is the traditional or the typical design which we follow here at Desert Resource Center. Communities, markets, and policies. Again, the impact has been very encouraging.
Both of you have alluded to the importance of linking traditional knowledge to new cooling technologies. How do you see this having potential to change the future?
We focus on women and youth. And women, they traditionally have kitchen gardens where they grow vegetables. So the aim of this initiative, Veggies for Planet and People, is to show women and youth who are normally less exposed to business opportunities and more affected by unemployment to use vegetable production not only just as a kitchen garden to feed your family, but to look at it as a commercial opportunity to really get a good income. So we've seen that people have expanded their areas. They are also using different types of inputs. We are moving from chemical inputs, chemical pesticides to non-toxic inputs. We call it regenerative agriculture. So it doesn't harm the environment. It's better for the human health and better for the health of the farmers who are producing. That's actually one of the pulling aspects, one of the attractions of what we do. Because regenerative agriculture, some might see it as going back to a grandparents used to farm, like manure, compost, and mulch. But don't forget that we're also focusing on pest and disease management. Every vegetable has different types of pest and disease threats, and we're dealing with a range of vegetables. It's a very interesting science. It's very knowledge intensive, but also skills intensive. It requires a lot of observation. So observing your crop, knowing what to look for, not only on top of the leaves, but also at the bottom of the leaves, differentiating different insects, looking at the damage, looking at what happens around the crop, not only on the crop, but in the soil, in other plants. So it's stimulating an environment where beneficial insects can thrive, so that feed on the bad insects. And also use biopesticides. So biopesticides are safe, natural products. You can make biopesticides by yourself using plant extracts from neem trees or other trees. But you can also buy some beneficial fungi. It becomes a bit technical here, but that is the interesting part.
Knowing that many women and girls and young people more broadly in these remote areas have relatively low levels of education, do you find that the science and technology is of interest to them?
You're asking what pulls farmers, what pulls women to this kind of farming. It's that innovative aspect, particularly youth. You explain about the technologies and how these products work. Fungi that you can mix, powder that you can mix in water and spray on your vegetables, and what they do to the soil and the plants and the insects, or using traps that have pheromones that attract male insects so that they cannot breed anymore, or using sticky traps where certain insects, the bad insects get trapped. All these things are technologies that are exciting, and you learn a lot about them. So it's that learning experience that really excites women and youth to get into vegetable production using regenerative technologies.
Concretely, what economic or social benefits do you see emerging as people get access to cooling?
We've seen that typically if women and youth and anybody else we work with can increase from a few square meters kitchen garden to a quarter of an acre, that is about 1,000 square meters, they can generate like between 3 and 4,000 US dollars in a year from that plot. That's quite significant. Realizing the income and the minimum wages in the countries where we work, but creating that space for women and youth with relatively little land is transforming their lives and opening all sorts of opportunities, not only income generation, but also women to be more equal partners in the household, in the society, and in the whole food systems. That changes their position quite a lot because, as you can imagine, if women gain income, they are empowered. They don't have to hold their hands up. They can buy the food for the family, for the household that they need. They can save money for school fees, pay hospital bills in case somebody is sick, to invest in other income-generating opportunities like maybe buying a sewing machine. So it really does empower women and creates a bit of a more level playing field between men and women, in other words, closing the gender gap. So having cold storage facilities, it will make farmers, women, youth more flexible and be able to combine it with other activities, household care, childcare activities, and create the quality of life.
Anshul, how is cooling changing the lives of the desert nomads in terms of income, livelihoods, or social gains?
Some of our herders have, from zero income out of their camel, have experienced anything between $200 to up to $600 or even $800 a month of income. So one of the enterprise called Samakhya Alternatives is working on passive cooling solutions, and it is using natural fibers, the sheep and camel hair, for developing the product line, which A has acoustics applications, B has insulation applications, and then a very interesting facet is how the waste in both these categories go into other derivatives in subcategories. For example, packaging or textile, or also quite possible in the farm, as farm enriching or soil rejuvenation. So coming back to Samakhya, some of these unique products which they have developed, what they're trying to do is use a wool and various compositions and invest money in the local capacities instead of putting the money on the machinery, and come with products which could have a far-reaching implications on built environment. So how these unique products could be deployed in urban markets in the built environment space and provide excellent insulation, but through product which is not a synthetic product, right? It is not PUF or it is not rock wool, but it is natural wool which has a very high VOC management. It has the capability of absorption of the toxicity in the room and yet provide the similar comfort, all passive. In some tests, Samakhya has achieved as high as 15-degree difference in passive. So that's quite a lot and quite encouraging in the cooling context.
This seems like a somewhat natural time to bring up the elephant in the room, so to say. That is, both of you are often working with very poor communities. Are they able and willing to invest in cooling solutions, even very basic ones?
You have to look at cooling technologies in the context of what is financially feasible and what is affordable by the different players, the producers, the transporters, the traders, the consumers. It does buy them more time, but at the same time, it's also it requires a completely new way of thinking, and it still requires investment. So the zero energy cooling chambers we've piloted in Ethiopia, and we thought, well, the bricks are something that everyone can make. However, the bricks are still too expensive for farmers, and so the whole structure would cost about $400 to $500. So that proves to be inhibitive in Ethiopia. So in other countries like Tanzania, it has caught on in some places because the cost of brick making is cheap. The bottom line is always the investment. How much does it cost? How can we get these investments back? When do we break even? And how do we spread these costs? A lot of these technologies, if you invest in them, you could break even within 1 or 2 years. However, for youth, they do not have that patience. So where another responsibility of us now is to explain about business skills, about business concepts that sometimes you have to invest and your investments might be more than what you get in terms of profits from the next season, but you have to look at 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 seasons before you get your investment back. And after that, your profits are pure profits and you don't have to recover the investments anymore. So these are the things that we are working with these farmers. As I said, we have 200 vegetable business networks. Some are more advanced than others. Some are very capital strapped. They don't have anything to invest. Others are a bit more advanced. So we look at every vegetable business network and see what their capacity is, what their financial liquidity is, what their appetite for investing is. And so for the more advanced ones, they are definitely interested and they invest. Now in Kenya, farmers have moved a little bit beyond that. And so they would prefer to go into charcoal coolers or these rental cooling chambers. Farmer network, a vegetable business network, would probably not be able to invest in it. But in Kenya, people are very business savvy, so they have also found a solution to that. So you can hire these cold chambers on a weekly basis, daily basis, or you can even negotiate on a volume basis. Like you have 500 kilograms and the capacity is a ton, 1,000 kilograms, and you only pay half of the cost, the daily fee of that particular cold room.
Anshul, I'm guessing there are not a lot of solid examples of viable business models for desert cooling. How is the Desert Research Center stimulating or supporting innovation?
We created a small innovation fund with support of some HNIs and some other foundations. And now what we're trying to do really is provide financial linkages in a very structured manner. Of course, after a very in-depth business modeling for these micro entrepreneurs, wherever we are deploying these solutions, be it active solutions or be it passive solutions, passive definitely relatively low expenditure. We are ensuring that there is a good case scenario, there is a market linkage, and then there is an investment which comes from this innovation fund. It could range between anything around $200 to up to, I would say, $5,000. What we're trying to do is provide, in exceptional cases, also some grant component, which could be 10, 15, 20%. And the balance is, structured in monthly or quarterly paybacks. Largely, we link it with the specific value chain. Say if it is a camel herder who has high potential of, bringing the money or has quick turnaround possibilities, then it'll be a different model. So it has to be a very, very bespoke modeling for the different value chains.
You've both discussed the need to work across technology, policy, markets, etc. Where are the current challenges?
One thing that I think is also important to consider is that for 2 of the technologies that I described, the zero energy climate chamber and the charcoal cooler, you need water. And for you and I, that seems like water is not an issue, right? We open up our tap and we have water. For our farmers, water is a very scarce commodity. And particularly in the dry areas where these technologies have the most potential, the most cooling effect, those are also the areas where water is the most scarce. So that is, in addition to the cost, that is sometimes prohibitive or a bit that makes farmers hesitant to invest, is the water availability. Water is used for household goods, for household consumption. It's used for irrigation of your crops, especially in the dry season when vegetable prices are high. You want to get as much vegetable production as possible. If you then also have to use water for the cooling technologies, it's a competition. So my message is that we need to look at all these technologies in a holistic way. I've talked about the technology, about the technical aspects. I've talked about the cultural and gender dimensions and economic dimensions, but we also need to look at infrastructure and dimensions that are provided by the local and national governments. So giving farmers and all the citizens in the country access to water, which should be such a normal commodity, that should really be a priority so that farmers can do their basic things, not only at the households level, but also at food production level to improve life. Already agriculture contributes to 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at all the inputs that are required for producing food and vegetables, and then you lose them, that is just unnecessary waste and unnecessary use of resources that contributes further to your carbon footprint.
Anshul, any last thoughts to share?
In the larger climate change context, and in general, towards promoting parity, I think what we're really trying to do, or collectively what we need to look at, is how do we bring in or prioritize the pastoralism or pastoral agendas in the global south. First would be the ecosystem approach, and why it's not just about technology, really. It is also not just about community mobilization, and also not about the enterprise which could be promoted in a certain production system. What really matters is how do you work in the ecosystem approach and see how all of these enablers are multiplied, and then they play a pivotal role in a certain cluster or in a certain value chain. So some of the lessons that we have are essentially around the ecosystem approach, which really needs to be shared and highlighted. Number two is, how the deserts world over need to learn from each other, learn to interact, and have a more vibrant sort of platforming or network, so to say. We have global alliances for other bioregions, but it seems that deserts are lacking in that space, and perhaps cooling technologies or cooling solutions could play that role of igniting those dialogues. How do we look at solutions from a world over and then initiate much deeper dialogues around desert bioregions? So ecosystem approaches and desert bioregions, these would be my important two aspects. Another very important aspect for us is to use this opportunity while promoting pastoral production systems to promote a much larger green value chain and the collective nexus. Because end of the day, if you want to look for greener solutions all across, here are some lessons. So not just for the pastoral production systems, but are there solutions or the lessons which we could learn from pastoral production systems or the pastoral value chains which are designed basis the cooling which is decentralized? What are the lessons which we could take to other parts? Deserts are very, very special bioregions. And as a matter of fact, they are today expanding. And when you multiply the impact of climate change on that, it puts us in a very unique, both the challenge as well as the opportunity. The opportunity part is, what do we learn from deserts? What is it that, from the resilience perspectives, we can derive out for the global resilience, in production systems, in consumption patterns, in practices, so on and so forth.
Around the world, the past 12 months have been the hottest on record in many places. According to the International Energy Agency, use of air conditioners and electric fans accounts for nearly 20% of total electricity used in buildings. But in the hottest countries, many of which are very poor, the majority of people are still unable to purchase even the most basic air conditioning units. Where people do have access to electricity, home refrigerators usually account for 20% of electricity consumption. Keeping food cool or frozen across retail chains can account for up to 3% of national electricity demand. And of course, food that is refrigerated during transport typically involves the use of fossil fuels and contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. Higher demand for space cooling and refrigeration is expected to drive up both electricity demand and emissions as temperatures rise, putting enormous strain on electricity systems in many countries and on household budgets. Cooling options based on passive solutions or distributed renewables do more than improve people's comfort and reduce food waste. Critically, they boost local economies in more sustainable ways. A big thanks to all 4 of the cooling experts we've heard from over the past 2 episodes: Bijal Brambat of the Mahila Housing Trust, Nurmita Chandrasekhar of Selco Foundation, and Anshul Ojha of the Desert Resource Center, all of whom work in India. And to Ralph Roothaert of the World Vegetable Center in Kenya. To learn more about the wide range of activity underway to improve access to energy and to efficient technologies in the Global South, visit the website of the Global SDG 7 Hubs. That's www.globalsdg7hubs.org. Search The Energy Talk on your favorite podcast platform to hear past episodes of this series. The opener examines the big picture of building up ecosystems to roll out local technologies at scales that deliver global change. Episodes 2 and 3 investigate how energy for agriculture can transform the lives of millions of smallhold farmers. The next pair focuses on the energy and health nexus. Following this set on cooling, we'll have one more episode on what's needed to accelerate both innovation and scaling up. For the Energy Action Project, ENACT, I'm Marilyn Smith.